you have a lot of experience working with European officials. You worked with the Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras at the height of the European crisis. I know this is a very different crisis, but when you look at the economic outlook, the lockdowns that we're seeing that are extending now in time, how pessimistic are you about the European recovery?
Thank you very much for the question, Maria. I actually am more optimistic than this for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is going to be a very, very, very strong US recovery, and US recovery always also has an impact on Europe. So we're going to benefit from it. Second, you're absolutely right. With further lockdowns, the situation could look gloomier. However, it is to be noted that we've adapted to the lockdowns. And when you compare them, and when you compare the first lockdown, they have had a much more severe impact on the economy than the further lockdown, in particular as digitalization has picked up. So actually, you're right, it will certainly delay some of the recovery, and recovery that was really expected to be strong in 2021 may be delayed to the end of 2021 and 2022, because typically in Germany, we're talking into coming back to the number of 2019, middle of 2022. However, it's a delay, but it doesn't, in my opinion, it will not influence the impact and the magnitude of the recovery.
And the other side to the story, of course, is the fiscal side. And we know that in the U.S., there's a huge package that's been approved. In Europe, we have that recovery fund. It's yet to be paid out. Do you worry that perhaps we're running on too little at this point?
What is very clear is that indeed the US have done a huge effort when it comes to indeed fiscal spending. And I think they're doing the right thing because that's exactly what is needed in the US. In Europe, for the moment, we are indeed slightly more moderate. And I think we should definitely increase because it's absolutely needed. And we also, of course, need to start having the debate around fiscal rules. I'm sure you've seen that this debate has already started because the rules have been suspended until the end of this year and may actually be further suspended. But on top of this, we have to discuss about these fiscal rules, if they are still adequate, if they need to be modified, or if we need to move from fiscal rule to fiscal standard, as some economists have been arguing for.
Right. And, you know, just for our audience, of course, the area of expertise in which you really focus is around debt. So at this point, it's very clear that many of these countries are going to come out of the coronavirus with a huge debt pile, perhaps 150, 140, 160 debt to GDP. Given that we have very zero interest rates and we have a very low interest rates at this point, do you worry about that debt or should you look at it differently?
I think we should look at it differently, but just indeed to give order of magnitudes. During the crisis, the last crisis, let's call it 2008 crisis, and from 2008 to now, some countries did increase their debt by roughly kind of like 15%. I'm talking for the Southern Europe countries like France or Italy and the equivalent. What is true is that in 1 year, countries have increased their debt by 17% of debt to GDP, which is massive in 1 year. However, as you pointed, rates are historically low. The central bank is definitely supporting the issuance of debt. And as a result, we indeed need to look at things in a different way. Those very low rates are a competitive advantage that Europe has and that it should use in order to invest and to do some really long-term investment, being in infrastructure, being it green, being in transitioning the economy, or be it in certain country having more kind of like health and education spending.
And Anne-Laure, just as a final question, in terms of the sustainability of some of that debt, is that something that you would say we don't worry about that element anymore? This is a very different framework.
Yeah, I think we should look into sustainability in a completely different way. As you know, sustainability is defined with some aggregates that in particular the IMF has kind of like stayed forward, and there is some stock and some flows element. The stock element for me should be kind of like much more undermined in the current crisis. So typically ratios such like debt to GDP should really kind of like be, I would say, overlooked because they're not as relevant. However, looking into any ratio that has interest payment is extremely important. And I think that's what we should be looking at. And we should also be very flexible into the ratios that we look at. We should look into several and we should kind of like vary because we really see that when shocks happen, I mean, the traditional ratios don't mean anything. And the biggest mistake would be to stick to the prior ratios, as has been the case in the crisis of 2008.